Anyway, so what I'm going to talk about is this new enhancement challenge from the Clarity project, which we believe is the first machine learning challenge that has tried to tackle the issue of hearing aids and hearing devices. And as you see, it's quite a big team. I'm Trevor Cox. I volunteered to present this, but obviously a big team, lots of different angles coming on this as well. If you want to know more, the website is at the bottom there. It has all the details that you would want to have, including the link to the GitHub and a link to the Google group to discuss things further as well. So I know we've got a mixture of backgrounds. So some people won't be used to working with hearing impairment or hearing loss. So let me just give you the context very briefly. Where the WHO says there's 466 million people worldwide who have some form of disabling hearing loss. And one of the problems you have if you have a hearing loss is hearing speech in noise. So pretend you're pre-lockdown, you go down to a restaurant, you try and have a conversation, you can't pick out your friend's voice against the hubbub that is around you. That's the kind of problem we're trying to deal with in Clarity, this speech and noise case. Now, in recent years, we've seen real transformations in machine learning, things like deep learning, which has transformed speech technology. And our idea is to try and take some of that learning across into hearing aids. And we're doing that by running a series of competitions. The Clarity project is actually a 5-year project to run a whole series of competitions. And as well as trying to make better hearing aids, our aim is to actually build a bigger community who include hearing loss as something that they deal with when they're doing, for example, speech processing. And that's the idea behind this, is bringing the hearing science communities, the speech technology communities, machine learning and signal processing together. So that's the background. The methodology we're going to use is a series of challenges. So for some of you, or many of you who've come in today, this is a very familiar thing, but in case there's people who aren't familiar, the idea of setting competitions or challenges that people enter is a really well-established route for improving research in signal processing. Here's some examples from speech. Chime is a good example because the head of the Clarity project is John Barker, who obviously has a lot to do with Chime, but there's been a whole series of these which have really improved the ability of processing speech or doing things like automatic speech recognition. So we hoped this Clarity project, which will use the same methodology, will achieve similar good effects on hearing aid processing and other aspects. So to get this to work, what we have and what we'll have in each round will be a task we're going to set, and I'm going to outline and spend most of today talking about what the first round task is. We have a set of rules we have to obey, and we have a set of evaluation criteria to give us something well confined that we're all going to kind of work towards. Of course, we need data sets that we work with and software tools that we work with as a baseline to build from. And again, I'm going to outline those for challenge 1 in a moment. And at the end of it, we will have a results workshop. And as like with all these other series you've seen on the previous slide, part of that workshop is saying, well, what worked, what didn't work, reviewing and presenting the ways people approach the problem, but also a chance for you as a community to feedback and say what the next challenge should be. Now, that result workshop should be at Interspeech in the summer. So that's where we're aiming for that results workshop. So the Clarity project as a whole is meant to be running 2 parallel challenges. One is about hearing aid signal processing, and we call that the enhancement challenge. And that is what I'm going to spend most of today talking about. We also have in parallel prediction challenges, which is about getting better ways of predicting how people respond to speech and noise. That has been slightly postponed because COVID-19 has made testing humans in laboratories rather difficult. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but just to say there is this prediction challenge, which we'll be launching later in the year. And we're going to have a series of rounds of this. We have 5 years of funding, and they're going to get more and more complex with each round building on the previous one. And the enhancement challenge, round 1, has just launched at the start of this year, or start of February to be more accurate. So I'm going to talk about now about what this enhancement challenge is. So we've got a simple situation where a person is in a small room. It's like a living room, so there's a little bit of reverberation. It's not very large. It's kind of typical home room. And they're listening to a target talker. And it could just be their spouse or their loved one or a friend. Simultaneously, there's noise going on. So this could be another talker say coming out of a television, or it could be a noise source like the kettle's boiling in the corner of the kitchen. So they're trying to pick out a single talker against a single noise source. And the room, the dimensions, the boundary materials, where the listener is, the target and interferer are, this is all randomized to create lots of different examples, as I would say. So that's the simple, possibly the simplest example of speech and noise you can think of. And that's what round one is. So the kind of timeline of this and the evaluation of it is we've just released training and development data, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. The test data will be released on the 1st of May. The entrance submission is on the 1st of June. And we'll rank these in two different ways. The first of all will be an objective measure of intelligibility. We're using MB Story for that, and that will be our first ranking. We will then also do a series of listening tests on intelligibility, where people will be listening to words in noise and scoring how many words they can hear correctly. And there are prizes for both stage 1 and stage 2 because of our sponsorship by the Hearing Industry Research Consortium. So there's a 2-stage evaluation, both have got prizes. This is the baseline system. I thought it'd be nice just to talk through the system we have in a diagram, and I'll take it apart in a bit more detail. So essentially, to do the challenge, you can use all or none of this as you kind of feel fit. Some of it you have to use, but you can reconfigure in any way you feel fit for machine learning. But this is our baseline system. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have scene generation. So this is actually creating audio samples, examples of speech with noise. We also, for any one case, have to pick out a listener. So we also have a selection of a listener going on in the top left-hand side. One of the important things about hearing aids is they have to be personalised to the hearing characteristics of each person. Hearing loss is very different from individual to individual. So the listener characteristics and the speech and noise feed into a model of a hearing aid. And this is our enhancement model. Now, this is what this yellow box on the left is what we're assuming that you're going to work on and replace. And in a traditional hearing aid, there's a fitting stage and actually in a hearing aid as well. We're providing a baseline model here based on OpenMHA, a few more details in a moment. Out of the hearing aid comes improved speech and noise. Now, normally that would go down into a little loudspeaker, which will go down to your ear canal. And then you'd have a human rating it. But we obviously in machine learning need some sort of algorithmic way of trying to work out what's going on. So in our prediction model, we have hearing loss simulation, which I'll describe a bit more in detail. And we also have a model of intelligibility, which is the MB Story. So at the end of this, we should have a prediction of how good the speech intelligibility is. So your job is to get a better hearing aid model to go into the yellow block. Now I can play you a little bit of what this sounds like. I've got here an example, and I just have to reshare a different screen because I didn't share the right screen. So if you just give us 2 seconds, let me share the whole desktop and that'll be easier. I'm just going to play you a few examples just out of it, just give you a sense of what's going on. So you're going to hear first of all some speech, then it will be some how it will sound through a hearing with the hearing loss, and then what it sounds like through a hearing aid.
Then there is the balance between stage and orchestra. Then there is the balance between stage and orchestra.
Now we'll do it with some noise.
You were talking in your sleep, she said. You were talking in your sleep, she said. You were talking in your sleep, she said.
So hopefully that'll give you a sense of what some of the tools will do. That's just some of the sound samples. Of course, you're listening down a team line, so you have all the additional compression of whatever this, whatever Teams does to sound, but just gives you a little sense of what we're producing. So let me take that apart in a bit more detail. So in terms of data, we have tools to generate scenes and training set. And the training set consists of 6,000 scenes, which are the input to the hearing aid. So what would be picked up by the microphones of a hearing aid in a room. You will also have within that binomial room impulse responses, which tells you what happens from the sound source to the microphone or the hearing aid. And we've also got the mixture of the target and interferer signals. So target, don't forget, is the speech we want enhancing, maybe. The interferer is the noise we don't want enhancing, we want to attenuate. And also head-related impulse responses, which is what happens to sound when it goes from the source to the eardrum. Of course, we have training and then we have development, so you can check how well you're doing during the development and machine learning process. And again, we'll give you targets, rooms and interferers as same as the training set, but of course different for the training set and with disjoint between the two. There will be an evaluation set that's launched in the 1st of May. That'll be 1,500 scenes. And then we also have the listener data. So we have how we pair the scenes up to the listeners and the characteristics of the listeners. At the moment, the listeners are characterized by audiograms, their threshold of hearing across a frequency range. And of course, alongside all the audio stuff, there's all the metadata, which is done as usual in these sort of things in JSON files. So this is the actual scene generator. We provided the tools to allow you to generate the scenes. You can download them from GitHub and run them to generate the vast amount of training data. And it's basically a convolution reverberation process for those who don't work in room acoustics. I guess most of you have this kind of experience, but in case there aren't, we essentially, what we have is we have, say, dry speech here, and then we convolve that with the characteristics of the room. Those are the room impulse responses. The room impulse responses are generated by a geometric room acoustic model. These are the kind of things that are used commercially all over the place to predict, I don't know, how a concert hall performs. And we also have a measured set of HRTFs that we're using, which come from the DENC database. So we convolve the room effect with the dry speech, and we do the same at the bottom by convolving the room effect with the dry noise. And then we essentially just add them together to get the speech and noise left and right. The one thing we have in the middle of this in purple is a change in the level. So we change the gain of the noise to get the right signal to noise ratio. So we can set a bound, a range of signal to noise ratios where we have a chance for improving the mix and therefore improving the speech intelligibility. So that's how we actually set the signal to noise ratio within some certain bounds. So that's the scene generator which we provide for you. And I've mentioned some of these details, so I won't repeat them, but we've got 10,000 configurations coming out of the geometric room acoustic models. So those are all randomly generated by rolling dice about how big the room is, for example, or rolling a dice to say, is what furniture's in there. And we have these head-related impulse responses from the DENC database, which are a great set of data measured on from sources to the microphones on hearing aids. And this generates about 10 million different stimuli through this process. In terms of source and receiver position, roughly the target speaker, the one that you want to enhance, is roughly in front of the listener. It's plus or minus 30 degrees, so it's kind of in front, but with a bit of variation. The interferer, the noise from the washing machine, can be anywhere, and we have limitations that things can't be too close to each other because things go a bit wrong then, or too close to the walls because things go a bit wrong in the model as well. But so the interferer can be anywhere, and so if you make a sound sample, for example, where the target and interferer are on top of each other in terms of direction, then things are much harder than in the case shown here, where the interferer in red is in a completely different angle to the target source. Again, this is all randomized in generating the material. The target speech, we've made a new corpus. So when we do speech and noise testing for listening testers, it's a variety of standard sentences we use that people listen to and write down what they can hear. The problem when we came into this is we needed a much bigger data corpus, and we needed a corpus we thought was much more up to date. So we've worked with the British National Corpus, which is a lot of material, some of it text transcriptions of court cases and all sorts of kind of things. And there's 10,000 sentences from there. They've been screened to give them a rough length, an exact length between 7 and 10 words. We've used databases to check that the words aren't incredibly obscure. And most of this has been an automatic process to try and come up with these 10,000 sentences. We've then done a final check to check whether there's any really strange grammar and vocabulary and remove ones which were particularly obscure. We recorded those with 40 voice actors. That was done over lockdown, so they recorded from their home studios, and each read 250 different sentences for us. That corpus is available and published, available for other use beyond Clarity as well. Interferers, we have speech is one interferer, and that came from another corpus, the SLR83. And then we have non-speech, which has lots of recordings of things like kettles and washing machines, vacuum cleaners, noise sources, basically with different frequency responses and slightly different temporal patterns. And that's the kind of noise interferer. Back to the baseline system, because I'm just going to take apart the various different parts of the baseline system in just a little bit more detail to remind you. So we looked at the scene generator. We're now going to look a little bit at the other parts. So we have the hearing aid model. And so our hearing aid model, hearing aid processor, is the open MHA model. We're very thankful for Oldenburg providing this and helping us out a lot with this. It's a behind the ear hearing aid, so the microphones, that's one you typically see. If you see someone with a hearing aid, there's microphones stuck behind the ear. What we have is we have Python configuration code that runs open MHA. So essentially, deep down in the master hearing aid, there's a lot of dynamic range compressors going on. You have to decide how to fit them. Normally, if you do this normally, you go to an audiology clinic and an audiologist would work out how to fit this. We obviously have to do this automatically, and we're using the CamFit compressive prescription, which Brian Moore and others worked on as a way of working out how to set the open MHA settings. Now, OpenMHA is a very wide and broad range of tools, and we've only used some of them in our hearing aid processor. So we've done in a sense, the basic configuration. We have multi-band dynamic compression. So we have dynamic compression different for different bands, and we have a polar pattern facing forward, a hypercardioid polar pattern. There's lots of other processing that hearing aids do. That's what HA stands for, I should say. But we haven't implemented it, partly because some of those are proprietary, but partly this is a baseline processor. This is what you're replacing. So we don't need to make it more complicated than we have already. You're meant to be getting a better thing than this. The hearing loss model is based on Moore and the Cambridge University model of hearing loss. And particular thanks here to Michael Stone, who helped us out with providing us with a MATLAB version of this that we then converted into Python. So it's an open source Python version. Now it deals with raising auditory thresholds, the loudness recruitment, and you would have heard, you may not have noticed it, it depends what you're listening to, the noise in the example went very strange, slightly warbly. That's due to some of the frequency selectivity issues that are modelled within the hearing loss model. And this is something you can use within to help you optimize your hearing aid processing of your hearing aid, or you don't have to. This is up to you whether you put this in the pipeline of your training and use it or not. This is an optional tool depending on how you decide to set up your machine learning. And again, we provide a baseline speech intelligibility model, which again will allow you during training to estimate what the speech intelligibility is likely to be for a listening panel. Again, this is optional to use. You can use other processes as well. But we provided the MB STOI, which is a fairly standard, well, certainly STOI is fairly standard, but we're using the modified binaural version, which is a cross-correlation technique, a double-ended technique for speech intelligibility. And because it's correlation based, it can deal with nonlinear processing, which is inevitably going to happen, especially when we start getting into anything to do with hearing aids. And it has a binaural stage, things like better ear, and also the equalization cancellation stage. Again, this is a tool that you can use within your process or not. It kind of depends on how you want to set up your processing. But this is the tool we're going to be using in the first evaluation of what we're doing. So in terms of submission, we're expecting you to run the processing yourself and submit stereo signals for the evaluation process. But we're also expecting alongside that for you to submit a technical document describing what you've done. So we're not running your code. We're expecting you to submit the stereo signals and provide those for us to do the evaluation on. So then it will go to some listeners, and we've got a listener panel we're recruiting at the moment. Things are slightly delayed in recruitment because of COVID, but we're getting around that now. But this gives you a sense of roughly what our listeners are. So there's about 50 of them. Some will have normal hearing, all adults. and they have a hearing loss between 25 and 60 dB in the sort of kind of frequency range 500 hertz to 4000 hertz in the better ear. They've got to be used to using hearing aids, and they've got to be used to using hearing aids in both ears, because that's what we're going to be processing. So they can have different hearing loss, but they still need to have bad enough hearing loss in both ears to need hearing aids. So that's kind of our listener panel. And so when you submit your signals, as well as look at the MB story, we're going to be sending some of them to this listening panel for evaluation. How many systems we send to evaluation will depend on how many get submitted and how many listening tests we can do. But we'll do as many as we possibly can. The listening tests are really interesting. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but essentially what's going to happen is we're going to be running intelligibility tests at home. So the listeners will log on to a tablet, they'll wear headphones, they'll listen to speech and noise, and they'll write down the words they hear in a traditional way. We're going to slightly update that, and we're going to actually get them to read back what they hear and use automatic speech recognition, ASR, to gauge what they give us, because it's more efficient. And that's one of the sorts of experimental things we're going to be trying. But this is the process. In the end, the systems are all going to be, all the ones that go to this stage will be compared with real listeners with real hearing loss in their homes to see how well they perform. To finish the submission, there's important rules, and I've gone online, there's a few more rules, but these are the crucial ones. And I guess the first one is the one which has prompted quite a lot of discussion. So hearing aids have to work quickly. We can't use signal processing that is not causal. So we have a stipulation that you can only use any sample inflation up to 5 milliseconds into the future. So kind of allowing you a little bit of a window, but not very much. And that's because if you don't stipulate such a short time, then you get into this problem that people can't lip read and things like that. We don't limit computational costs. We decided at the outset that we wouldn't limit it on the first round to make sure we had lots of approaches being attempted. So hearing aid itself has limited battery life, obviously has limited processing capability, but we at this stage didn't want to limit what people could do. So feel free to use whatever powerful computers you have available. Obviously, in the future, we'll have to consider how to get this to work within a hearing device. But so that's not limited at the moment. We provide training data. If you want to bring in extra training data, we don't mind, but we ask you to also train a system on the official training data set as well. Again, because this is the first hearing loss machine learning attempt that's been done, we want to not be too restricted in some of the rules, because we want to see what happens. That's part of these sort of challenges, is that things evolve over time. So we don't want to tie down too many things, but we do need to be able to compare systems. So if you use any of your own training data, we also expect a system to be submitted, which is entirely done with our official training set as well. You need to describe what your submission, and we encourage everything to be made open source, but it isn't compulsory. But more you can publish, the better it is, as far as we're concerned. So that's the website, claritychallenge.org, where all of this is on actually in much more detail than I went over in this kind of 30-minute presentation.